Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Beyond Zero, How to Achieve Sustainability in the Built Environment. This is the second webinar in our three-part series provided by the DAR Group for the Major Projects Association. My name is Scott Smith, and I'm Head of Sustainability for DAR UK. I'll be facilitating the webinar and will be helping in the Q&A session after the presentation. So please feel free to ask any questions during the talk through the Q&A function, and we will try to answer them at the end of the presentation. I would like to introduce the speaker for today's event. Our presenter, Dr. Asif Din, is the Sustainability Director at Perkins & Will in London. Perkins & Will is a major global architectural practice spanning primarily North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Asif is instrumental in ensuring that sustainability is a major priority at Perkins & Will and has raised the profile of carbon proficiency by ensuring that the costed zero carbon report is provided at the end of concept design for all projects that Perkins will undertake. Asif has over 20 years experience delivering zero carbon projects, including master planning, buildings, and product design. So as you can see, Asif, as a key principle for sustainability at Perkins & Will, brings a wealth of knowledge to the topic of this webinar. Therefore, let me hand over to Asif. Asif?
Hello, everybody. Let's just start by the actual title itself. We've had quite a bit of debate about sustainability in the past, and sustainability in the built environment, as a matter of fact, is quite a narrow definition. It's not the Brundtland definition of effectively dealing with future scenarios. It's actually dealing with the here and now. And, sort of like I toyed with the idea of actually using different titles like, sustainability is dead or something more controversial, but it's actually talking about effectively sustainability in its widest sense, because currently sustainability in buildings isn't quite what it's cracked up to be. So what do? We design buildings. But in matter of fact, those buildings are an entity in themselves, and we don't actually consider anything out of that box. Now, in terms of the regulations that we have, our regulations are not, sort of like they're minimum standards. They're there to keep us safe. It's not actually enough to actually talk about sustainability with regulations. Regulations are there as a safeguard, and it has to go beyond the regulations. Now, as the building industry is quite economically driven, shall we say, the minimum standard becomes a maximum standard, which doesn't help in terms of sustainability at all. And sort of like sustainability is a broad-reaching amount of different aspects, and that's what I'm going to run through in this presentation. Because, sort of like you can think about it in terms of very, very narrow terms that are disjointed in terms of a reductionistic way of looking at a system. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk in terms of, sort of like opening up the system and for you to actually look at what is the range of different aspects that you have to consider that may not be working in your favor if you don't consider them all at the same time, or at least see what the impact is of each individually. In this presentation, you'll not see lots of things of pretty buildings. This is not really an architecture presentation. This is more a presentation about process. And it's our individual process in terms of what we're doing at Perkins & Will to actually make sure that we're designing the right thing in the right place. It's not really about sort of saying we have done 0, X, Y, and Z, or we have done something incredibly well and we've forgotten everything else. Now, the first thing to remember effectively in terms of regulations and in terms of guidance is that buildings are still energy driven. Now, energy driven doesn't actually mean that it's a good building. Take sort of like an example of when I was working earlier on in my career. I worked on BedZ, a housing development in South London. Now, we went to the engineers and basically said, create a zero carbon building in terms of zero operational carbon building, a zero heating building. These were the days just as Passive House was picking up, and they came back with essentially a brick box with no windows, which was unusable but met all of the criteria. Now, that is an extreme example, but in matter of fact, if energy is used as the only criteria, then things like daylight, health and well-being, indoor air quality, a range of other aspects do not actually figure. They have to be considered in parallel completely, and some of those may fight the original premise, especially if you're talking specifically about, say, zero operational carbon. Similarly, water. Water is usually dealt with, as with energy, energy is dealt with usually on an annual basis. It's almost ridiculous to just think about energy on an annual basis on whether your building is performing well or badly. And then similarly, to actually have a water consumption per person or a water consumption per year, again, is a bad metric. It doesn't really give you a full picture of what is actually happening. Now, even I hold a doctorate in, sort of like carbon, but you try to get me to envisage what a building would produce in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and I struggle. I cannot actually visualize what that actually means. And if I can't visualize it, I'm quite sure that most people, and especially most clients, can't visualize it either. So it's important to actually say what things are in a range of different aspects. And it's not just solid metrics or imagine certain amount of hot air balloons that's actually going to make you think about sustainability in a project. It's going to be a range of different aspects that you have to consider. And sort of like a good example is the NHS. The NHS, the buildings only actually contribute only 10%. The range of other services, food, pharmaceuticals, they actually consider, they are the predominant energy, sort of carbon consumers, make the most of effectively the footprint of that estate rather than the buildings themselves. And if you don't consider that, then considering your building may be pointless. It's the old argument effectively of having an eco house in the countryside where the owner drives a Porsche or a Ferrari. He's a rich client, but a matter of fact, what's been done in terms of the building is totally eclipsed by something else that is external to that building envelope, the red line that most sustainability actually deals with within buildings. And then again, transportation. Transportation is a third. Essentially, if you're taking somebody's footprint, a third essentially is buildings, a third is food, and a third is transport. All three have to be considered. Otherwise, again, there will be negative feedback loops, or what you're doing essentially is, to one degree or another, is greenwashing effectively their lifestyle or what they're actually portraying in terms of trying to do something in the built environment when other aspects are not considered. So going back a stage, this is not a linear process. It is an ecosystem that has a range of dependencies, and there's no one correct answer. Each project is absolutely different. To actually say that we're going to target one thing in one project and ignore other things is also, frankly, not the right thing to do. Part of what we actually are trying to do is actually raise the game across the whole board. It's trying to make sure that as an ecosystem, the ecosystem functions well and is, for want of a better expression, sustainable. Want to express better expression, regenerative, in the sense that it doesn't deteriorate over time. Now that means that single aspects have interrelationships with other aspects. Now, if we go back effectively and look at the traditional water flow and energy flow that we actually deal with within buildings, and which what most regulation deals with, it's even the definitions are hazy. Is it regulated energy or unregulated? But each one of those, both the energy flow and the water flow, can have influence on other things. So a good example is water flow and, well, linking water with energy is a hot water load within buildings, or dealing with energy and indoor air quality. Energy and carbon is another one. There's a range of different bits and pieces that do naturally or automatically link, but their dots need to be connected. If you are just going for a single aspect, it won't really work. Now, you could say that effectively, sort of like, we'll do certification. Certification will deal with this. Certification is good if it's used in the right way. In its purest sense, certification is a fantastic database of all different metrics and all different methodologies, and actually how to measure and validate what you're actually trying to do. In its worst case, it's effectively point chasing. So somebody has a gold building and they basically say, what is the minimum that I need to do to get my building up to platinum? What is it that actually I need to do? Now, they don't particularly mind or particularly care which category it is, how it relates to the culture of what they're trying to set out in their brief. It's a goal in itself. And as a goal in itself, certification is the wrong tool effectively for sustainability in building. What has to be thought about is the individual tailored solution for any individual building. So this means talking about social purpose, excellence, and part of that is actually research into what the client actually wants and actually trying to deliver that as part of the process. And it's a tailored solution. It's not a one size fits all. Now, one way that that could be done is effectively to do a risk assessment, to do a sort of like a shocks and stresses assessment of the company or even the entity of your client. So this could go all the way from a single house, sort of like, what are the things that make the householder feel that, is working against them in terms of their home? What would they like? What is the frequency of that? And what is the impact? In the same way, for a large organization, what is business continuity? What are the most important factors? To address those and to make sure that in the long term, all of those things are assessed and to make sure that that becomes a future-proofed building that not only lasts for until handover, but lasts for the lifespan of the building. So again, it's going up and down scale very, very quickly. So from the very basics, we are actually looking at the occupant. And the occupant is actually the key to most of this, is looking at who the occupant is and what their actual needs are, and then designing the building around them, as opposed to the traditional sense of designing buildings in that you design from a top down. So you design from the bird's eye view effectively of the master plan and you drill down. You had to design bottom up. And to design the bottom up, then you find the correct measure for the correct aspects to make sure that you are delivering what you actually need. This also needs to be scale agnostic. It has to be equally applicable at a district level, to a building level, to even a country level. It's sort of like, it's not, the system has to apply itself at a range of different scales. It cannot be just one single scale, because if you are just dealing with one single scale, then you are going to be missing out on what actually happens at the scale down and the scale up, which also may have negative feedback loops. So at the end of the day, you are using perhaps the certification as to provide that scientific test, that validation, but it's going to be multivariate. It's effectively one thing impacts another, impacts another. We have all seen this graph before. Effectively, what are the benefits in terms of investing within your building compared to what you are actually going to get out of your workforce? But, sort of like, what are the actual benefits of, I don't know, let's say circadian lighting. Circadian lighting within an environment to make sure that you actually can demonstrate increase in productivity, increase in, decrease in the amount of days off taken, to actually show what can actually occur. Now, part of this has to be a narrative, because essentially not all of this is quantifiable. And what we can actually talk about when we talk about narrative is essentially it's the starting point, it's the vision of what actually needs to be achieved. And from that, you can achieve, what are the indicators required? What are the benchmarks and the techniques that you're actually going to use? Now, this might mean that you're looking at other people in terms of what other processes or what other projects have actually made sure that, sort of like these sorts of things were considered. And it's about looking at those things in the round. So you're looking up effectively from this aspect, but then you're also looking at a range of other aspects to make sure that no negative feedback loops actually exist. So as a firm, we have condensed this in terms of some broad categories. Now, this may be completely different for your organization, but it's important to actually say what is the framework? What are the other things you're going to look at once you've started at one point? And one of those points is sustainability, but you cannot look at sustainability without looking at resilience, regeneration, inclusion, and well-being. And all of this needs to be done at individual scale level to make sure that it's on an individual, sort of like, it's the actual occupant in terms of a micro level. The meso level could be the building, and then the macro level could be the district or even the city. So looking at the themes again, effectively, inclusion is it equitable? Resilience, can it handle shocks and stresses? Sustainability, can it achieve potential in terms of its global purpose? Regeneration, can it actually provide more than actually you're putting in? It's going beyond that zero. Effectively, can the regeneration aspect, what influence does it have beyond the site boundaries? Because we're too actually concerned about our building as an entity in itself, an autonomous unit, when in matter of fact, it's a jigsaw puzzle. It plugs into the rest of the city. And then well-being in terms of the actual occupants themselves. Now, if you look at each one of those as an individual title, you'll actually see that effectively we have these natural processes anyway. So you have a sustainability, a steady period, a resilience period. COVID could be that resilience period. We have that dip, but the regeneration is how you actually pick that back up to then have a steady state again. And in terms of the world, or in terms of the history of the world, we've had plenty of those extinction events, times of crisis that then have to be picked up within the regeneration within buildings. And this goes into effectively looking at that regenerative design aspect and looking at other aspects that have been done by Kate Raworth and others in terms of donut economics. So make sure that you are replenishing resources if they are diminished. Now, this cannot happen if you think of within siloed solutions. Now, in terms of buildings are, well, the cast is thousands, essentially. And it's a case of trying to get as many of those cast members in the room early on to make sure that rework doesn't actually occur. Now, this in terms of, say, LEED or another certification is called integrative design. So can you make sure that everybody's needs and concerns are actually voiced early? Otherwise, what's going to happen is somebody's going to have a grand vision. It's going to go a certain way down the line, and then another consultant or somebody else that's feeding into this process will undo work, and then it will have to be redone again. This is not the same effectively as design feedback in terms of making the design better. It's actual rework in the sense that it's wasted time. Analogies could be made with sort of like chess playing and sort of like progressing pieces, but wasting time is something that we all don't want to do. And in matter of fact, we need to be able to make sure that all things are dealt with as early on as possible, because that's when they have the greatest impact. So it's a case that the most projects will effectively have something that will start somewhere, whether the client is interested in regeneration, inclusion within the occupants themselves. But each one of those aspects can actually then feed back, and then you have to look at the other aspect to see where the negative feedback loops could actually exist. But where does it all start? Effectively, it starts with a story, and it has to start with that original vision to actually know where we're actually sort of like, what is the journey process. And from that, you can build up that stronger and stronger narrative until then you can start creating the scientific tests and facts that you need to make sure that all of those things occur at the same time. So let's just go into a little bit more detail of what the aspects that we've chosen as a firm to actually concentrate on. In terms of sustainability, it is the traditional ones. It's energy and water. It's also materials in terms of material health, to actually make sure that we're reducing the amounts of toxic materials that we're actually, or materials that have human health impacts within the building itself. In terms of resilience, it's assessing shocks and stresses, but these come in, sort of like environmental, economic, and social, and making sure that what we're providing is actually almost a sustainable business model that is allied to a building asset, rather than saying that effectively it's an asset. So we're dealing with the environmental shocks and stresses, and we're dealing with something to be essentially as resilient as it can be in terms of, almost over-engineered as a worst case scenario, without considering economics. There is always going to be an element of following a single pursuit to its natural conclusion and getting somewhere that you don't really want to go. Now, the thing is to draw back from that and making a sensible case for it with the other aspects that you have around it. In terms of regenerative, it's talking about those positive factors. Effectively, can you make your building positive energy, positive water? Can you restore the site in terms of its ecology, its ecosystem, to make sure that it actually can be continuous in some sort of sense and actually provide positive impact beyond its site boundaries? Inclusion, community spaces, actually getting people actually involved at an early stage. This goes back slightly to sort of like the integrative design. Quite a lot of projects do not actually consider the people outside of the site boundaries, and by not considering the people outside of the site boundaries, then make it contain negative feedback loops for those individuals, which will actually come back and actually, will fare badly on the actual project itself. And then well-being, air quality, acoustics, and biophilia. So what do clients actually want? The clients actually want their vision to be throughout the project. So in the sense, the narrative has to convert itself into effectively the DNA or the sticker rock or the ethos of the project. And it has to be revisited and refined, and it needs buy-in from the widest amount of stakeholders that you can get a hold of to make sure that those negative feedback loops don't exist. Now, we've done this in terms of, sort of like a range of process mapping early on within projects. Now, this was taken actually from a Herman Miller website, but it's a similar sort of process to actually investigate different aspects and say what works well, what doesn't work well on a range of different solutions. Now, COVID in itself has its own range of different aspects. So realistically, everybody on this call now is not going to be designing the same way that they are in the future as they were, say, 2 years ago. That doesn't mean that, a matter of fact, what we were doing 2 years ago was wrong, but we have an additional lens. In the same way that I've been talking about sort of like looking at a wider viewpoint, by looking at the COVID lens, we are seeing things that may have, sort of like impacts and feedback loops that we weren't considering before. And life cycle analysis can be used as a link for that. Yes, it's impact assessment, but in the same way that, say, computational fluid dynamics can be used as a tool, life cycle analysis can be used as a tool to quantify things and think about things in terms of a circular economy, in terms of that regenerative design. One of the obvious aspects is effectively buildings are over-engineered and we are demolishing them before their actual end of life. And it's a case of looking at what we actually have and actually saying how we can actually use that. Now, in terms of us in the office, we have actually created a roadmap. And in a similar way, I would probably suggest that any client that you actually see, you should be continue considering not only their sort of like corporate and social responsibility roadmap, Road to Zero Carbon, but also what they actually want to achieve along that timeline to make it real, so that effectively it's not maybe this project that's going to be reaching their end goal, but it may be the third project down the line. You build that relationship to make sure that you're planning for that future, so that you're exploring the right things, the right effectively keystones within that project to make sure that it actually occurs. So quantifications through life cycle analysis, we can, sort of like this effectively becomes life cycle analysis plus, effectively looking at buildings as material banks, reversible fit outs, other aspects which actually will add impact in terms of a life cycle analysis early on within the process. But looking at the broader scope, you're actually reducing that more and more within the whole actual system, and thinking about the time aspect, which is not fully considered actually within the built environment currently. So we have looked at a range of different materials, how you can actually use modularization to actually create more of that red zone. Effectively, the red zone is stuff that you're going to obtain benefit from in the future, rather than the blue zone, which is the upfront carbon. Now, we've also done roadmaps to operational carbon, and sort of like looking at what aspects, what pieces of the jigsaw puzzle do you actually need? And in matter of fact, we provide this, as Scott said, early on within the project at stage 2, because if you don't have this type of thinking in terms of circular economy, life cycle analysis, and zero carbon early on, it's not going to happen. So it needs to be early on, so that the conversation can happen early on, to make sure that it's costed and that you can actually say how much an impact that's actually going to have. Again, there's a range of different aspects, especially with sort of like, with buildings, in terms of the features that they're actually going to have, to make sure that that actually occurs. But I am an advocate of checklisting. Yes, it is boring. Yes, it goes against quite a lot of what is design ethos and the freeness of design. But it's important that you check yourself in terms of having certain gateways and certain milestones, to have a list that you then are narrowing down, but then expanding back out to make sure that those negative feedback loops do not exist. It's thinking in the same way of sort of like Edward de Bono's 6 hats, those sorts of management tool techniques, to make sure that you're thinking outside of the project to jump back in to make it a better project overall. Thank you.
Yeah, it was very informative and interesting presentation, Asif. There's been a few questions. I'd like to ask a few of the ones. One is, is there a better way to create the sustainable metrics that can measure sustainability, or in your opinion, do we need bespoke metrics for each project? I know you kind of went into a lot of detail about the metrics that Perkins and Will use and stuff, and some of them are not really fit for purpose.
I think generally overall, it is, you have to look at the metrics for individual clients, because the actual culture of an organization, sort of like let's take some extreme examples. You're designing a transport hub one day, and you're designing a server farm the next day. Now, to try to use the same sustainability metrics or the same metrics for both doesn't really make that much sense. They have different usages, different occupancy, different goals and aspects. So in matter of fact, what you have to do is actually look at what is the actual usage of the building, who is actually going to occupy it, and then derive your metrics from that to see what maximum impact can actually be obtained.
Then in your opinion, does that mean that you kind of need to bring the client along to, create the knowledge and their understanding that, the metrics that you're working with, or you've proposed, would provide a better solution, or as opposed to, say, sustainable certification?
I think it's important early on for a client to actually sit down with, with us or with somebody to facilitate, to actually say, what are their outcomes? What do they want in terms of their outcomes? Now, realistically, sort of like sometimes it can be very, very hard nosed. It can be, we want an economic outcome. But if you're then going to stretch out that economic outcome over the lifespan of the building, it suddenly becomes a sustainability outcome. It becomes a resiliency outcome. It becomes a well-being outcome. So by starting with that conversation of saying what the actual vision is, then you're introducing subjects for them to actually think about and then feedback to you. At the end of the day, sort of like we all have clients.
Yeah.
Sort of like as an organization, we have clients and we won't do anything that a client doesn't want us to do. So it's always that we're going to show them what different lenses that they can look through their asset through, and then see what they pick up, and then show how we can deliver on those aspects to the best of our ability.
Okay. Let me ask you this question then. This is from the Q&A chat. Given the requirements of different users, purposes for buildings, plus the different requirements that are contextual to the building's location, city, countryside, hot location, dry location, etc., is there any way we can generate meaningful worldwide benchmarks?
My honest answer is no.
Right, okay.
To a large degree, it's sort of like life cycle analysis. Say, sort of like say you were doing the carbon impact of an office fit out. Now, one office fit out may have a canteen in it. Another office fit out may not have a canteen in it and only has, I don't know, client hospitality areas. How can you compare that to an office fit out which is just open plan office space? It's not really that feasible, no matter how you break it down, in terms of per square meter, per person, whatever you do. The metrics are going to get incredibly hard to compare. And to do that on a global level in terms of a project in New York compared to a project in London, compared to a project in Abu Dhabi, is very, very difficult. I think what you have to do is you have to set up on your benchmark and then you have to beat that benchmark. Yes, regulations are there as, sort of like the fail safe, but to actually push the boundaries, I think you have to create your own benchmarks and you have to create your own scenarios and see what are the drivers of that scenario to actually achieve better ones in terms of metrics as opposed to benchmarks overall.
So kind of sustainability is a bespoke process in some senses.
I think so for all
Okay.
projects.
You spoke about negative feedback loops. Is there any way that we could foster positive feedback loops in our projects? I mean, I would assume that your kind of carbon analysis at stage 2 is a positive thing to create that narrative to explain to the client. But are there other things that help in a project as opposed to destroy the project?
It is attitude and process. Unfortunately, it's effectively, sort of like it is making sure that what you design or what you're actually putting down on paper has the buy-in from the other stakeholders, other consultants, to actually know that that's going to be carried through. We've all been down the process of, say, a design and build project where what you have on paper is not what is actually going to be delivered on site. Now, in some sorts of ways, it's that communication between, all of the players, the constructor, facilities manager, the client, to make sure that the outcome is what everybody expects.
Okay. Here's another one. Vision, ethos, stick of rock. How could the principles of benefit realization management be applied to this approach?
Ooh, tough one. Realization.
Well, I guess trying to
Yeah, please jump in, Scott. Come on.
Obviously, you're trying to give kind of carrots or kind of rewards for virtual projects and sustainable targets. How does that fit in with your kind of Perkins and Will ethos?
Well, it's more that effectively setting out the vision early on within the project and making sure that that's a robust vision that then can be revisited throughout the project process, so that you know that you're still delivering on that. It's those Chinese whispers effectively, which is the design process, which you have to make sure that you go back to the source to make sure you're actually delivering what you were meant to deliver, as opposed to what you think you should have been delivering.
Okay. From Perkins and Will's perspective, which regions do you see leading the way in terms of implementing sustainable retrofitting? And is there any particular client base doing more work than others in banking, tech firms, et cetera?
Right. In terms of retrofitting, I think, sort of like we're still looking to, sort of like some projects definitely on the continent, especially on in Holland, especially around circular economy, sort of like circular thinking. I don't think anybody's fully cracked it, to be quite honest. There's quite a lot of benchmarks that, sort of like targets are actually out there. I would actually argue that the RIBA targets and the LETI targets in terms of new buildings cannot be achieved unless you have a retrofit of an existing building, at least the bare bones, at least the structure. You will not be able to actually obtain those carbon levels thinking about things within the same sort of framework of the construction industry today.
Okay. Are you proposing carbon as a single metric?
Carbon is an indicator, but I wouldn't say, sort of like, this is a slightly difficult one, because yes, in some sort of ways, you always have to put a figure to something. But as I said with life cycle analysis, if you were just going to go for the upfront carbon, then you will get negative feedback situations. Like quite a lot of the US, for example, are looking at life cycle analysis, but they're only looking up at what's termed as effectively cradle to gate. But that ends up that you are actually favoring quite technological materials, plastics, stuff that is lightweight early on within the process, and then not really think about it later on down the line. Carbon can be used as a single metric, but not in its current regulatory guise, I suppose. And it has to be almost a bespoke process. But as a bespoke process, you have to be clear what you're counting and what you're not counting.
Okay. You talked about life cycle analysis. In my opinion, it's always very hard to do at early stage because it's very hard to get all the information together to make it informative. Do you recommend, or in your opinion, should the life cycle analysis be continuous through the project? And do you think that you need to educate the client of the benefits of doing this throughout the project, or is there appropriate stages for doing this?
You're perfectly right. Most of these metrics do need to be tracked throughout the project, because effectively that becomes the vision, the stick of rock. Effectively, that you're going to track these metrics, and you're going to make sure that they're actually delivered, and what you set out originally is actually delivered, checked against. What I would say effectively about life cycle analysis, that it should be done, sort of like in terms of RIBA stages, it needs to be done at concept stage, just to make sure that you know that what your correct target is for the type of building you've got. The actual benchmarks that are out there are kind of not specific enough. So that is actually needed at stage 2. From there, then you need one essentially at the end of stage 3, one at the end of tender stage, and then one after the building is built.
Okay. Here's one. Does the rebalancing away from office-based work environments following COVID-19 create an opportunity for an urban design and construction equivalent to rewilding?
Yes, in an answer probably, or in the simplest way. But no, we're actually coming more and more towards the cities as complete mixed-use environments. And I think COVID will actually help that in certain sense. In the long term, what we're going to see effectively is the more mixing up of processes. So that we know that effectively we're going to have that load balancing in terms of energy, in terms of resource use, and the vibrancy that you actually need. So in some sort of sense, it is, sort of like the rewilding sense is, in a sense, that people will occupy more spaces at a more consistent level. So yes.
Okay. Here's one from Simon Lovegrove. He does healthy living communities, and new projects are more complex to plan sustainably owing to the changes in technologies, but worse is how even whether people will change their attitudes. Have you any ideas? Like, well, for example, he says use of cars. Have you
Yeah.
any ideas on this?
Well, this actually goes back to my early days at BedZ. What we did at BedZ is that we came up with a term called an eco slob. Effectively, what would be the least path of resistance for any occupant to actually take? And from that, we actually designed processes, simple things, simple, sort of like daily ballets that we undertake, sort of like taking out the rubbish, um, look, sort of like being informed on the energy that you use within a building. And we made sure that those things were in the correct place. So, for example, at BedZ, all of the meters are on display in the kitchen. Um, the bin stores, sort of like you have separated bins within the actual unit itself, and then you have a bin store which are clearly marked. So there's a certain amount of resistance, a certain amount of effort. So you tend to waste less because you don't want to fill up your bin. It's those little tiny things that effectively are nudges. It's effectively that nudge sort of mentality of saying, what can I do to make this more meaningful? What can I do to make sure that this becomes part of somebody's routine that will naturally lead to them thinking more about it and actually reducing the consumption or reducing sort of like their footprint overall.
Okay. Another one is projects will evolve. There are new technologies, new impacts that are coming. One, say, is the banning of petrol cars and going towards more of an electric car and electric buildings per se. Is there a way that we can predict the future of things better, or
Predicting sort of like predicting the future is always dangerous. Effectively, everybody knows that. But what you have to do is almost build in that becomes effectively within the resiliency aspect. It's looking at the lifespan of a building and actually saying, what to the client, sort of like how long realistically are we going to be designing for, and providing that loose fit, that flabbiness effectively within the design itself to make sure that those things can actually go in. I think it's very, very wrong to try to predict, sort of like processes, technologies, and quick fit solutions. We've seen this with global warming. Oh, we'll deal with that later. Some of the technology will come along and provide that magic bullet. It's sort of like we cannot do that with buildings. They have to deliver from day one. So, in matter of fact, what we need to do is actually create that resilience overall to make sure that things can be plugged in, but not rely on any one technology.
Okay. This is from Hannah Kenyon. She's a sustainability planning specialist who has been developing a sustainable standard checklist. It includes water use and flood risk, biodiversity, active and green travel, and aligning with net zero carbon, sustainable construction, waste, materials, and voluntary sustainable standards, would you widen this list?
It's kind of hard to say because effectively it's going back to the certifications thing. It's sort of like some of the certification points are relevant to any one project and some aren't. And the problem is with, certification and points and obtaining credits is that those credits can sometimes be seen in isolation and not seen holistically. And I think what I'd probably be saying is effectively not all projects would have all of those things on the checklist, and it's important to filter those down early on to make sure that you're looking at the right things and then looking around at the other parts of the checklist to make sure that no negative feedback loops exist.
So it kind of goes back to the, our previous questions about educating client or getting and informing the client to agree on a series of metrics that you think is more appropriate for a project than just a checklist of nondescript metrics.
Well, it's not that they're nondescript. They're all relevant to a certain degree, but they're all relevant to a particular project. And that project may not be the project that lands on your table.
Okay. What can we learn about the design of new buildings that might inform and the refit and repurposing of the existing building stock?
I think there's just essentially it's about modularization and design for disassembly. I think too many times in the past we've actually just designed buildings as an entity in itself, something that is an object that will last. And we've not really thought about the maintainability. Now, you could even take that for, I don't know, even modern buildings like the Shard, for example. Sort of like the way that that facade maybe is maintained is not perhaps the best way in terms of the impacts it would actually have on the works overall on the building. So we have to think about how buildings are repaired and how buildings are eventually taken apart, and those elements used again as Lego bricks for something else.
Okay. Organizations are now adding a cost for carbon into their business cases and project plans. Could we apply this to either aspect of sustainability, resilience, or well-being?
Well-being, tough one in terms of, but sort of like, but I don't. It'll be interesting to have some sort of metric, essentially, in terms of how well you're looking after your staff and what metric that would be in terms of a tax overall. It's kind of, it gets into very, very sort of interesting ground in terms of what would be the metric that you would actually use. Now, you cannot use carbon for everything. And I don't think you can really use carbon for wellness in that sort of sense. It has to be done effectively on a personal level, and in some sort of ways, it needs to be done at a qualitative level rather than a quantitative level.
Okay, yeah, I guess well-being is that kind of strange one that it's more subjective, more about stuff, and it's hard to have an empirical measure on that score. Okay, here's one. Are there gaps in our capability to undertake comparisons of reuse with new build?
Yes. Again, in a word, I have seen quite a lot of occasions of essentially things being reused that shouldn't be reused because they just require so much effort to take out of somewhere else and then repurpose. And then other aspects of things ending up in skips that shouldn't end up in skips that effectively, have so many years of lifespan still left in them, but the easiest course of action is to put them in a mixed recycling skip and say, well, it's somebody else's problem, it will just get recycled. We do have gaps in our knowledge, but I think it's up to us collectively to actually re-educate ourselves to actually know what those actually are. If we don't know what they are, it's a case of going back to manufacturers, and this probably goes back to the wider team and who is the cast that goes into making a building, and actually saying, going back to and the manufacturer and the extended manufacturer responsibility type aspects to actually say, how can this be repurposed? How can this be reused? Can it be reused for these sorts of purposes? And that's part of education on us as in terms of designers, but it's also in terms of constructors, in terms of demolition experts, and also in terms of manufacturers as well, to actually make sure that we all collectively go in the right direction and have proper purpose in what we do.
Okay. Here's one. This kind of goes back to being able to predict the future. We're trying to change people's minds in regard to owning cars. In your opinion, should buildings or homes be built now without the kind of criteria of cars or transport, personal transport?
No, it's sort of like, because you could end up in a very, very sticky situation that you get farm owners basically saying, I can't own a car and I can't get anywhere. Again, it's horses for courses to a certain degree.
Yeah.
On where is the local infrastructure? What can you actually do in terms of London boroughs, for example? There's quite a few that are actually saying they want car-free developments, and when public transport or when aspects around a site have the right amount of infrastructure, then it should be true that we should not be sort of like incentivizing private transport ownership, because there is public ownership around it and public amenity. But it is a case of the correct project, and sort of like sort of I think this question probably goes back to what I said about an eco house in the middle of the countryside with somebody driving a sports car. It's making sure that effectively the client understands what their impact is by driving that sports car to an eco house, and what a lot of money they've probably wasted overall, and they should be actually looking at their whole lifestyle as opposed to just one aspect of it.
Okay. Do modern manufacturing techniques and design for manufacturing and assembly provide us with easy ways of buildings in sustainability? This is like off-site manufacturing and modularity.
We're still really at the infancy of that, to be quite honest, and they have negative feedback loops as well. So like you think about, say, overheating with residential with modern methods of construction with lightweight processes, with not adequate shading or not adequate sort of like window wall ratios. There are negative feedback loops. Yes, it can provide that, but I think we're still in our infancy, and it's up to designers to actually look at those processes and say, what systems are correct for the building that I'm trying to design, and what are the ones that we shouldn't. For a south-facing building that's highly glazed, to then use something that's lightweight is essentially a no. You cannot do that, because it will have negative feedback loops in terms of overheating, energy, comfort, a range of different aspects.
Okay. In terms of the range of sustainability measures that can form part of a development, example, sustainable urban drainage systems, heat pumps, rainwater harvesting, etc., which tool is best for planners to ensure all of these measures work well together and the development is as sustainable as possible?
I think I'm going to pass on that one. If I was given gel out of free gel, so
it is a bit of a loaded question.
I'll ask for this one to be it, because in matter of fact, I don't think there is any tool that does everything incredibly well. It's almost a sense that you need to mesh a range of different aspects together to try to do the best that you can. It's effectively your own sort of professional judgment that you will actually use within that to actually say, I understand that these have impacts on these different range of areas. How can we find the correct middle ground, or the correct level that we want to obtain in any one of those to create the best outcome overall? I think this goes back to, effectively, to do a single metric is wrong, as I sort of like pointed out. But It's actually the weighting of those individual metrics, I think, is more professional judgment than anything else. I don't think you can really rely on a tool to say, this is the answer. This is
Yeah.
what you actually need to do.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, Asif. The range of projects that we are in at, or we get involved in, and the types of environments and the actual pressures in each one of these locations, it makes it very hard to come up with a specific, all-encompassing tool that will allow you to measure something that's meaningful. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Asif. That was a really interesting talk, and it was, kind of, showed, something that's more outside of, architecture, is more of how to manage a sustainable project, whatever it happens to be, from, from architecture, to probably transport to other areas of kind of construction and infrastructure. So on that, I want to thank you for the presentation, and I'm going to introduce Andy Murray. He's the executive director. I demoted him last time when I introduced him. So yes, I'd like to introduce Andy Murray to let you know about the upcoming major projects coming our way. Andy?
Great, thank you very much, Scott, and thank you also, Asif, for really an insightful session. Lots of food for thought for many of us to take forward, and also just like to thank the attendees today for some great questions and some pretty tough ones for Asif to answer there. So just like to signpost some of our events coming up. We've got a pair of events coming very soon. One on the 16th of June around the role of the sponsor. There's so much evidence that shows the impact that good and poor sponsorship has on project outcomes. Yet, if you do a review of frameworks and guidance and competency frameworks and so on, it's not very well defined what the role of the sponsor is. So we're going to be exploring that. It's a pair of events, as I say, because we have a roundtable discussion on new sponsors, people in early careers, and what sort of development needs do they have as a roundtable discussion this week, heading into the main seminar next week. We then have a Cube at Work, which is sort of Second Life conference environment, fascinating way of exchanging ideas and connecting with others on the 17th of June, and that's around the neuroscience of managing change. We've got our one-day simulator on the 24th of June, open to members and non-members. And then we've got the last of these 3 sessions from the DAR group on sustainability, and the next one's around net zero engineering solutions. And so we welcome, hopefully, many or all of you back to that session at the end of the month. I'd just like to signpost the Menti code. We really value your feedback, so you can see it on the screen there. It's a little bit blurred on my one, unfortunately, or it might be my my contact lenses, but 91214404. If you can pop that code into your browser or your app, if you've got it on your phone, we're really keen to get your feedback. That's all from us today. Really enjoyed that session. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Asif.